Thank you very much, Ambassador Park. That was a very kind and very substantive introduction, so I thank you for that. And I'd like to thank the Korean Foundation for Advanced Studies for hosting me, and for all of you. I know there's another crowd on another floor, but I'm really grateful for all of you coming out today to hear my talk. So the topic is whether we are in a democratic recession. As you may have gathered, this is another way of revisiting the topic of my book, The End of History, because I argued that in that book, contrary to the Marxist view that history was directional and would be heading towards some form of communism or socialism, what I argued back in 1989 was that if there was any trend in modernization, it was towards some form of liberal democracy. And what I'm going to do with you today is to review the empirical record on that, where I think we'll find that over the last 40 to 50 years, there has in fact been a massive shift in the direction of democracy, but that over the past 8 years, there have been setbacks, and in fact, something that could be called a democratic recession. And I think we are in a very delicate time at the present moment, because I'm not going to be able to predict to you which way that trend is going to go. I tend to be confident about the future of democracy for reasons that I will explain, but this is an open question. I am not a Marxist in the sense that I don't believe that there is a motor of history that inevitably leads us in a certain direction. I think that our political choices matter a great deal. Human beings exercise agency and choice over the kinds of political regimes that they live under. And those choices will be very critical in the coming years. All right, so let me just say a couple of things by way of introduction. Many of the data slides in this presentation are actually not mine. They come from my close colleague, Dr. Larry Diamond, who is the director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford, where I work and teach. We are very close colleagues, and I am very reliant on him for a lot of the information here. So let me begin with a couple of definitions about what it is we mean when we talk about liberal democracy and what's been going on in the so-called third wave. The third wave is a phrase that was coined by my professor, Samuel Huntington of Harvard University, who argued that there was an initial wave that began with the French Revolution and culminated with the democratization of Europe in the 19th century, a second wave that occurred after the Second World War, after the defeat of Germany and Japan, but then another third wave that really began in the early 1970s in Southern Europe, spread to Latin America, to Asia, and in a sense culminated with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think that that wave really lasted up until the middle of the first decade of the 2000s. The wave was actually very impressive, and it means, among other things, that a majority of the countries in the world today are democracies, or at least electoral democracies, and a majority of the world's people live in democratic societies. And this was not the case 40 years ago before the wave unfurled. Now, let me give you some definitions. So if we talk about a simple electoral democracy, this is the most relaxed definition of democracy. What we have is a system for people selecting the government, some form of accountability by which people can choose who rules them and reject people that they feel are not the appropriate choices. And we understand democracy in this sense in procedural terms, meaning free and fair multi-party elections in a political environment that permits enough freedom of discussion, of choice, of participation to make the selection of political leaders viable. So we need free, fair and hopefully multi-party elections. Now that's a very restricted and limited definition of democracy. If we think about a higher quality level of democracy, a full liberal democracy, we mean several other things besides majority rule. So of course we want popular sovereignty and the people's choice of their government, which means competition and participation by as many citizens as possible. But we add to that the liberal part of liberal democracy, which means a constitutional system that protects the rights of individuals. It protects minorities from the will of majorities, so that a democratic majority cannot do anything they feel like to an individual for reasons of race, ethnicity, language, and this sort of thing. The final element of a high-quality democracy really has to do with what's called good governance. I would say this has very much to do with the state. A liberal democracy really is comprised of three different institutions. So the first one we talked about, democratic accountability, the free and fair elections. The liberal part has to do with the rule of law, the ability of law to protect the rights of individuals and to restrain powerful people in the state from abusing the rights of ordinary citizens. But in addition, and this is a really important point which I will go into in much greater detail a little bit later in the presentation, in addition, you have to have a state, meaning you have to have an institution that concentrates and uses power to protect the community, to deliver basic services, security, education, healthcare, infrastructure, and the like, to enforce laws, because democracy is simply not about the constraint of government, it is also having a government that can deliver. And so that includes things like the actual enforcement of law, horizontal accountability, and effective states. And I would argue that one of the problems we've been having and one of the weaknesses in democracy lies in that third basket, the absence of effective states. Now, there's a tendency for people to be very pessimistic these days about the prospects of democracy. But I think it's important to understand what a broad and deep phenomenon the third wave was and how much democracy there is in the world today. So I'm going to go through a few data slides that illustrate the kinds of changes that have happened in the world since the year 1970. Or actually, this begins with the Spanish and Portuguese transitions back in 1974. So the top line, the red line, are electoral democracies. That's the weaker definition of democracy, and the line underneath it are true liberal democracies. And as you can see, there has been a huge increase from, if you take electoral democracies, only 29% of the world's countries back in 1974 were electoral democracies, and today 61.5% are. And so the shift to democracy has really been quite substantial in that period of time. This is a slightly different set of numbers. This is based on Freedom House and the Freedom in the World Index that Freedom House publishes that measures both political and civil freedoms around the world. And again, as you can see, both for the world as a whole and also for developing countries, there's been a pretty steady uptick. So by the Freedom House rankings, a 1 is the highest ranking and a 7 is the worst. And we've gone from a world average of 4.47 to 3.29 over that 40-year period. If you look at regional trends in democracy, the gains to democracy have been pretty much spread around the world, and then much more dramatic in one part of the world than the other, which is Central and Eastern Europe. So that line in the middle that goes up very rapidly in the year 1989 is obviously the countries of Eastern Europe. But as you can see, virtually every other region in the world has shown gains. However, those gains are not equally distributed, and certain parts of the world at the end of the third wave were considerably more democratic than others. So here you see both electoral democracy and liberal democracy for various regions. So the first set of bars is for Europe and the Anglophone countries. The second group is for Latin America and the Caribbean. The third is for Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. The fourth one is for Asia. The fifth is Pacific Islands. The sixth is Sub-Saharan Africa. And the last set is the Middle East and North Africa. And obviously, as you can see, it's Europe and Latin America that are the most democratic regions in the world. Asia does not do very well. And actually, if you weighted Asia, this is simply a ranking in terms of the number of countries, but if you rank them by population, Asia would do even worse because China is obviously not a democratic country and has such a large population, although I guess that does include India, so maybe that's a little bit more evenly balanced. And then obviously the Arab world in particular, but the greater Middle East has been an outlier in the relative absence of democracy. So this brings us to the democratic recession, but before we get to that point, let me say a little bit about why the third wave happened, because I think that this phenomenon is not an accident. I think that there are larger structural forces that have been pushing the world in the direction of greater democracy. And that structural force is really the force of social and economic change. Between 1970 and the eve of the global financial crisis in 2008, the total output of the world economy quadrupled. It increased by a factor of 4. The world, in other words, as a result of globalization and the adoption of markets in places like China, the liberalization of the Indian economy, the transition out of communism of much of Eastern Europe, the growth of market institutions in many parts of the world where they did not exist, led to a huge expansion in global output. And this in turn produced enormous social changes. And in particular, it produced the growth of a global middle class. A lot of people have written about this. A lot of businesses are very excited about the prospect that for the first time in world history, you have probably on the order of a couple billion people out of a population of 6 billion that by various measures would count as middle class individuals. My teacher, Samuel Huntington, wrote a very well-known book back in 1968 called Political Order in Changing Societies. And one of the most important points that he made in that book is that from a political standpoint, middle-class people are, in a certain way, the most critical and the most important for both the spread of democracy but also for stability. He would define middle class not just in income terms, but in terms of occupation and education and the ownership of assets. So you are middle class if you have, let's say, at least a high school and probably some amount of higher education. You're middle class if you are a professional, if you work in, if you've moved over into a service industry. You are middle class if you own some durable goods, if you own an apartment or a house or even a car or home, appliances that you worry about. You worry about the government taking it away or in other ways harming your own economic well-being. But the most important thing has to do with expectations. Samuel Huntington said middle-class people have much, much higher expectations of life in general, but particularly of politics. and therefore they have always been the most destabilizing force in global politics. And I think that if you look around the world today, where we've had any number of so-called color revolutions, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, or most recently this umbrella revolution in Hong Kong, but I would include the Arab Spring in this, almost all of these upsurges of popular protest have been driven by newly middle-class people, by students, by people who for the first generation were educated, unlike their parents, and whose expectations for opportunities in their own lives expanded greatly. And the big threat to authoritarian government, I think, comes from this class of people, people who have those expectations but find them disappointed by the prevailing economic and political atmosphere. And so you can see this even in so I know, as Ambassador Park said, we've all been very disappointed by the outcome of the Arab Spring, which has indeed turned into an Arab winter in every country except for Tunisia. But I would note that even in the Arab Middle East, it is the case that the protests against authoritarian government in Egypt and Tunisia in the first stages were led by exactly the same class of people that has led protests really ever since the French Revolution against authoritarian government. That is to say, urbanized, better educated, more cosmopolitan, rising middle class people. And I think that shows even in that part of the world, this general social phenomena remains the case. And it will be the case in China as well, because China is a country that has a middle class now that consists of perhaps 400, 500 million people, and it's getting larger day by day. And that middle class has been largely content under the current system, but in the future it may not be. So I'll get back to the question of China in the future. But this is basically, I think, if you had to be, in the long run, optimistic about why democracy might spread around the world to other countries, it has to do with this phenomena of economic growth leading to social change, leading to greater demands for political participation. And the big question about democratic transition is whether democratic movements can create the institutions that are needed to actually institutionalize democracy and take this underlying demand for participation and transform it into something that is politically durable and sustainable. All right, so if we could go back to the slides. So we're going to now talk about what's happened over the last 8 years, because beginning in 2005, we have been in what Larry Diamond calls a democratic recession, and I think there's very little question about that. So if you look at the aggregate numbers for democracy around the world, by either the Freedom House scores or other scores that academics have devised for measuring the extent of democracy, it peaked in the year 2005. And actually, for the 9 years since then, those scores have been falling every single year. The total number of electoral democracies has varied, and these are countries at the margins, that some of which are pretty marginal democracies, but it declined to 116, and then it's gone back up to about 120 today. And by the way, that number was 35 in the year 1970, so 35 to something over 110, so we still have quite a lot of democracies in the world. But there's no question that over the last 8 years, that number has declined, 8 consecutive years of declining freedom scores, with losses outpacing gains. So it may be a little hard for you to read this chart, but basically this is the ratio of gains to losses for democracy for each year from 1991 up until 2013. And if the bar is above 1, it means there's more gains and losses, and if it's below 1, it means that there's more losses than gains. And as you can see, we've been losing ground steadily since the year 2005. And I think there's a qualitative dimension to this because many of the countries that have slipped back into bad authoritarian habits are not minor countries. They're not little island nations somewhere in the Pacific. They are big countries and they're influential ones. I think perhaps the most important of these is Russia, because back in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, I think many of us, myself included, had hoped that Russia might make a transition like Poland or the Czech Republic or other countries in Eastern Europe to being something like a real European liberal democracy. And yet, over the past, well, really ever since I think President Vladimir Putin came to power in the year 2000, Russia has the democracy part, but it doesn't have the liberal part of liberal democracy. That is to say, there's majoritarian voting, but there's not a level playing field for the opposition in terms of the freedom to organize. The state controls the media. Individual rights to protest, to voice opposing views have steadily been crushed. But there are other important cases as well where democracy really has not been working well. That list of countries that's on that chart. And the rate of democratic breakdowns has been increasing in this period, with 28 breakdowns or reversals of democracy since the year 2000. And again, this shows you that the rate has increased in the most recent time period from 2000 to 2013. If you go by region, Africa hasn't seen any dramatic coups, but there's been a steady erosion of democratic practice and a rise of ethnic politics in countries like Nigeria and Kenya that mean that contestation, although there are elections and there's political competition, there's also a high degree of corruption and a high degree of ethnic violence. Now, this chart was actually compiled before the most recent Nigerian election, and I would say that that election actually gives us a little bit of hope, because the Nigerian government, democratic Nigerian governments, have been among the most corrupt and incompetent of virtually any country holding democratic elections. And their performance against this Islamist insurgency, Boko Haram, has been terrible. The country has not been able to provide the most basic security for its citizens that live in northern Nigeria. And actually, I think that the election of Muhammadu Buhari, the rather decisive election of an opposition politician in that country, despite the election rigging and the high degree of corruption, I think is actually a sign that there is a democratic spark that still exists. But nonetheless, for the region as a whole, the trends have not been good. If you look at Latin America, this is a region of the world I know quite well. I think on the whole, Latin America is pretty successfully democratic, but clearly there have been trends in the opposite direction, led by Venezuela, whose populist democracy has been basically imploding over the last, especially over the past year with the collapse of oil prices. But there are a number of countries, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Ecuador, Argentina, in which liberal protection of rights of individuals have been very seriously eroded. So there are democratic elections. You have a form of populism there. There's no question that many of the presidents in these countries are very popular with their publics, but they do not respect good democratic norms in terms of permitting political opposition, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the like. So there again, we've seen deterioration overall in the region. Now, this is the point that I think is critical to many of the democratic failures that we have seen around the world. If you remember, I said that there are three components to democracy. So there is democratic accountability, there is the rule of law, and then there is the state, all right? These three elements do not fit in a necessarily harmonious whole, because the first two of those institutions are basically institutions of constraint. Democratic elections and the rule of law fundamentally seek to limit the power of the state. The rule of law, for example, is not the rule of law unless it applies to the most powerful individuals in the country. So if the president or the prime minister or the king can make up a rule as they go along, that's not the rule of law. The rule of law is fundamentally a constraint on power. The state, on the other hand, is really about the generating and the use of power. And so a true liberal democracy is a balance. It is a balance between the power-generating institution on the one hand and the power-constraining institutions on the other. And I think, as a general rule, that many democracies have gotten the democratic constraint part of it down reasonably well, but they failed on the state part, the creation of an institution that can actually deliver the kinds of goods and services that people want out of their governments. People don't want to just vote a lot of times for the sake of voting. They want to vote because they want to elect politicians that can provide roads, health, education for their children, security, and things of that sort. And it is obvious that there are many democratically elected governments that have failed to do this. And I think, actually, that many of the democratic weaknesses and failures that we've seen are actually failures of state action rather than failures of democracy per se. So let me just, if you can put that list back up on the, let me just go through some examples of this. Let's begin with Ukraine. Ukraine experienced its first revolution, the Orange Revolution, in 2004, because the president at that time essentially stole an election. And so a lot of students came out on the streets and protested that they forced a new election. There was another one, and the Orange Coalition was elected into power. The Orange Coalition, although democratically elected, could not govern. It was internally divided. A lot of the politicians leading that coalition were themselves corrupt. They squabbled, and they failed to solve any of the underlying economic development problems that faced Ukraine at the time. And as a result, the former president, Viktor Yanukovych, was reelected in a free and fair election in 2010, and then the whole process had to start over again at the end of 2013 with a new round of protests when he announced that he would not pursue association with the European Union, but in fact would move closer to Vladimir Putin's Russia. So the failure in Ukraine was not per se a failure of the democratic institutions, because Yanukovych was democratically elected. The failure was in the rule of law and the state institutions that simply could not deliver the kinds of goods that the Ukrainian people wanted and demanded. And right now, in Ukraine, although there is a very severe international conflict with Russia over the Donbass, over the Russian, basically, they've tried to indirectly take over that part of eastern Ukraine. But I would argue that that is not the most serious challenge facing this new Ukrainian democracy. The biggest challenge is the challenge of corruption. If they cannot get corruption under control, if they themselves, as a democratically elected government, cannot make their own political system work better, then they are going to fail, and they will deserve to fail. That's the real weakness in Ukraine. Similarly, in Egypt, you had the Tahrir Square uprising, and then what looked like a democratic revolution. In fact, I think the army in Egypt never actually retreated. It simply backed away from President Mubarak temporarily and let a political process go ahead that then resulted in the election of the first president, democratically elected president, Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, that then triggered the military coup. But the thing that I would say about that process is that to this day, it is not obvious to me that the more liberal pro-Western forces in Egypt were actually weaker than the Muslim Brotherhood. A lot of people say Muslim Brotherhood constitutes the majority opinion in Egypt, and that simply is not borne out either by the election or by a lot of poll data. The problem with the liberals in Egypt was that they couldn't work together. They couldn't agree on a single candidate. They couldn't form strong political parties. They didn't know how to organize, and they did not know how to appeal to poorer, less educated, more rural kinds of voters that would be necessary really in that country to support any kind of lasting democratic consensus. So I actually think that the failure in Egypt was a failure of institutionalization rather than necessarily the fact that the Egyptian people wouldn't support a more liberal and genuinely democratic kind of government. Third example is India. Now, India has been a great democracy ever since the birth of the Indian Republic in the late 1940s. It has a vigorous free press. It has vigorous opposition parties. You've had changes in political power between parties. So nobody would complain about the health of Indian democracy, which I think is all the more remarkable given the religious and ethnic and caste differences that exist within Indian society. The problem in India, I think, is one of the government's failure to deliver basic services. There was a study done by Jean Drèze, who's an economist and activist, back in the late 1990s that showed that in a number of poor states in northern India, 50% of school teachers were being paid to be teachers, but were not showing up at their schools, 50%. This failure is what's holding India back. It reduces Indian competitiveness. It increases the already high degree of social inequality in India. So nobody in India thinks that this is a good idea, that teachers shouldn't show up for work. And yet, despite about 10 years of attempted reforms, when that study was repeated down the road a few years later, it turned out that virtually the same percentage of teachers were not showing up for work despite being paid. If you look at infrastructure, this is the one area where China has huge advantages over India because the Indian political system has proven extremely, it has failed to deliver on municipal water, highways, airports, electrification, a lot of very basic kinds of services that governments are supposed to provide, where the comparison with China is really, I think very poor. And I think one of the reasons that the current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, was elected by a fairly substantial majority in the last election is that a lot of Indians themselves are, in a sense, sick and tired of weak and ineffective government. They want strong government. They want a prime minister that can actually build things, that can break through all of the log jams and gridlock in the democratic politics of India. Bangladesh has got a different problem. Bangladesh, again, has democratic elections and pretty open contestation, but it has got an unbelievable level of corruption led at the top by two political parties that are essentially patronage chains run by these two senior female politicians who have been rivals of each other for the past generation, neither of whom has done anything, in my view, to actually advance the situation of people in that country. Bangladesh actually does pretty well on a lot of social indicators. It has a big garment industry, a big manufacturing base, does well in infant mortality, maternal health, and so forth. No thanks to the government. No thanks to the government. There's a lot of other things going right in that country, but it is not the government that is responsible for it, despite the fact that it is, in theory at least, democratically elected. Finally, you get closer to Europe. Why did Greece get into the crisis in 2010 over the euro? All right, Greek public debt at one point reached over 200% of GDP. They could not control public spending. Why was that? Greece has been a good democracy since 1974, after the regime of the colonels was replaced by an elected, democratically elected system in which two centrist political parties competed with each other and alternated with each other in power. So the democratic part of the system in Greece was working very well. The problem in Greece was one of what's called patronage or clientelism. Every time a new party came into power in that country, it would fill the public bureaucracy with its own party members. And because the civil service laws in Greece forbid firing civil servants, with every turnover in government, you would have an expansion of the civil service, such that by the time of the euro crisis, Greece had 7 times the number of per capita public officials than Britain did at that time. And that was one of the reasons they could not control their wage bill. That is one of the reasons that they had fiscal deficits. And to this day, despite all of the pressure that has been put on Greece by the Troika, the so-called Troika, the European Central Bank, the IMF, and the EU, despite all of that external pressure, the Greek political parties have still not conceded the principle that they should not be able to appoint their own people whenever they are elected into office. And this is a continuing problem that I am afraid is quickly heading to a crisis within the Eurozone. Now, let me turn to some other problematic cases that I think will define our world and how democracy will do. And these are the ones that make me pessimistic about some of the major trends that are going on, because this list of countries is a pretty important one. So let's begin with Turkey. So what's wrong with Turkey? I think that, and my colleague Larry Diamond, I think, says this quite forcefully, I don't think that Turkey actually counts as a liberal democracy any longer, despite the fact that Prime Minister Erdogan remains a very popular, he's now a, they changed over, he's now president rather than prime minister. So he wins elections. His party, the AKP, has won elections now for more than a decade by very substantial margins. But Turkey has been at the forefront of a global effort to crack down on civil society because President Erdogan does not like criticism. Turkey now jails more journalists than any other country in the world. A lot of Turkish journalists who previously were unafraid to speak out against the government censor themselves. Opposition political parties have to be very careful about the things they say about the government. And essentially, the degree of competition, political competition, that is possible in that country has become extremely restricted over the last 5 years. Now, I don't know whether this is because Mr. Erdogan is an Islamist or because he simply has a lot of authoritarian tendencies. I don't know his psychology well enough, but the effect is basically the same. The scope of freedom in that country has been reduced very substantially, and because Turkey has been doing well economically and exerts a great deal, in fact, it projects a huge amount of economic power into Russia, into the Middle East, into South Asia. The example that Turkey sets is very important. Second case is this gentleman, Viktor Orban, who is now the Prime Minister of Hungary. Now, I put Orban up because, and not Putin, for a good reason. I think that Orban's case is more telling in a way than Putin, and it's more troubling in a certain sense. Hungary was the first former communist country to democratize after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Hungary became a full-fledged liberal democracy very rapidly after 1989. They held elections, they had stable political parties, they had an open media, so they looked like they were doing well, and many observers around the world, myself included, thought everything was secure there, that this was a country, this was going to go on to be like, the Netherlands or Sweden or some other consolidated democracy, that they would not go back. Whereas I think most people thinking about Russia always realized that Russia would have special problems in making a transition to democracy. So I think, a lot of us are not surprised that Russia has gone backwards, but nobody expected Hungary to do this. And yet this is exactly what's happened under Prime Minister Orban. His party, Fidesz, won a majority, a substantial majority. It actually won a slight majority in the popular vote, but because of the proportionment in the electoral system, they won a sufficient majority in the Hungarian parliament to be able to amend the constitution at will. And what they've done is to amend it in a way that completely cuts out the possibility of serious opposition to their own dominance of the political system. And they've taken a page from the playbook of Mr. Putin and Mr. Erdogan by controlling the media, buying up important media properties, and then basically setting the agenda by their use of the media. And I think what's really telling is that in Romania last summer, Viktor Orban gave a speech in which he basically praised Putin, praised Russia. This was after the invasion of Crimea, and said that his purpose and Hungary's goal was not to be a liberal democracy, but to be an illiberal democracy. He actually used these terms, that they wanted to be an illiberal democracy, because this represented really what the Hungarian people wanted. And the reason I think that this is very important is that, most autocrats in the world are hypocrites, including Vladimir Putin. They don't honestly say what they're aiming for. Most of them just want power. They want exclusive power, but they say that they're really in favor of democracy and freedom and all these other good things, including Putin himself. But Orban didn't say that. He said, we want illiberal democracy. We want democracy, popular elections, but without the kind of freedom that exists in the rest of Europe. And I think that the reaction on the part of the rest of the EU to this challenge, this ideological challenge, has been extremely weak. So Thailand, I'm sure you have followed. This is the overt reversal of democracy in the coup that happened last year. I think that Thailand is actually a bellwether for a lot of other countries because it actually shows that my earlier assertion that middle classes are important to democracy is not always true. All right, the Thai middle class in the 1990s did support Thailand's transition from military government to democracy, but since then it has turned against democracy. And the people that are behind the coup, the political support for the coup makers, the army and the monarchy, are actually the Thai middle classes. And the reason for that, I think, is social inequality and populism. Because Thaksin Shinawatra, the leader of the populist party that has won every Thai election, really since the late 1990s, whenever there's a free election, Thaksin's party wins it, is a populist party. There's a lot of corruption. They have a big program to redistribute money to rural poorer Thais in the countryside, and the urban middle-class elite in Bangkok really hate this. And they've had this extremely bloody conflict between the so-called yellow shirts and red shirts over what's, I think, basically the failure of the Thai system to address in an equitable and impersonal way the problem of rural poverty, agrarian poverty in that country. And the result is the overt reversal of democracy by this gentleman. So finally, I'm going to end up on China. China was never a democracy, and it's not likely to be any time in the future. But as Ambassador Park said, in this part of the world particularly, China is very important. The model that China sets is very important because other people pay attention because of China's size and because of its influence and because of its success. I mean, frankly, if China were not doing well economically, I don't think people would pay attention to the China model. But this is a country that has grown for much of the last 30 years at more than 10% a year, despite the fact of being a very large and complex country, and it's done that under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. In my latest book, Political Order and Political Decay, I actually have a couple of rather detailed chapters on China, and I have to give them credit for doing certain things well. For example, they are one of the few authoritarian countries that manages succession well. They've had three turnovers of their entire leadership on 10-year cycles. They've got mandatory retirement ages. They've got something that looks like a spreading, if not rule of law, it looks like, rules that govern the behavior of their elite. And other authoritarian countries have not done this. So Colonel Gaddafi was in power for 42, 43 years, Mubarak for almost that length of time. If they had stepped down after 10 years the way the Chinese leadership has done, they would be in a much, much better situation. Obviously, what China has that these other authoritarian countries do not have is a competent state. They've got a state with enormous capacity to make and enforce rules, to set policies, and then to enforce those policies because they are run by a disciplined Communist Party. And that's why I think people take the China model seriously. But there's a great deal of weakness in this because of what the Chinese themselves call the bad emperor problem. And this, I think, is the problem that no Chinese regime from the first founding dynasty, the Qin dynasty in the 3rd century BC up to the present, has been able to solve. The Chinese have a system of a very powerful and indeed modern state with no institutions of constraint, no rule of law, and no democratic accountability. What that means is that when the emperor is a good emperor, things are great. And I think Deng Xiaoping was a great emperor. He could do things that a democratic politician would be unable to do in terms of the economic transformation of his country. But there is no guarantee that you'll have a continuing supply of good emperors. And China has had a number of terrible emperors. I would say the last really bad emperor they had was Mao Zedong. And I think that in the future, this is the big liability of China. You could have a charismatic leader appear who accumulates power by defeating all of his rivals. And then at that point, he can either do good things or he can do bad things. But if he does bad things, there's nothing the Chinese people can do to stop that. And we'll have to see about the current leadership because it has been accumulating power in a rather stunning way with this anti-corruption purge, really, of the party. Xi Jinping is likely to be the most powerful Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping and possibly even since Mao Zedong himself. And we will simply have to wait and see whether he turns out to be a good emperor or a bad one. So let me conclude. I'm actually here for a hidden purpose, because I think that it should matter to all democracies whether democracy does well in other parts of the world. Democracy is an idea first and foremost, and part of the reason that the democratic idea has spread in the third wave was that other countries were seen as being successful, and they got support from countries that had made the transition to being consolidated democracies. And South Korea was one of those countries. The South Korean transition in 1987 was one of the most important turning points in the third wave, when a military dictatorship gave way to an elected, fully liberal democratic regime that over the years has become, I think, very deeply entrenched and consolidated in this country. And I think that countries like South Korea have a duty and an obligation to support other democracies in the world. Other countries making the struggle to do exactly what South Korea did back in the late 1980s need support, and they need support because of all the things I've said about the democratic recession. We are living in an age right now when authoritarian countries are feeling confident, they are projecting their influence beyond their borders. There's something like an international authoritarian movement to suppress civil society around the world. And that's why I think that democratic countries like the United States, like South Korea, need to work with other democracies around the world. So this country is going to host an organization called the World Movement for Democracy in September, which is it's really made up of a collection of democratic activists from countries that have not yet achieved democracy in different parts of the world, where they exchange views, they support one another, they learn best practices, they get a better understanding of the challenges that are being faced by would-be democracies in different parts of the world. And I'm really quite grateful to Korea for being willing to sponsor this event, and I hope that in this way and in other ways as you go forward, you'll continue to do so. So it's important to all of us, because I think we like living in democratic societies, not just because necessarily we get rich that way, but also because I think it allows us to be fuller and more complete human beings. And so hopefully this democratic recession will turn out to be something like a stock market correction in a larger pattern where the spread of democracy will continue into future generations. And I think all of you here can help promote that in the future. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Fukuyama.